That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the lake. Our gospel calls it the Sea of Galilee, but it's a lake, a freshwater lake, Lake Tiberias. Do you have a favorite lake? For many of us, there's some lake that has played an important role in your life. Being by a lake is so restorative. Do you have a lake in your life? Even right now, many of the people joining us on live stream today are actually sitting by a lake, either in Minnesota, wave to the people in Minnesota, or in Missouri or Iowa. Do you have a lake? One lake played a big role in my life. It's where the Door County Peninsula in Wisconsin jets out onto Lake Michigan. My entire life, we have vacation there in those little villages along that peninsula, Ephraim, Fish Creek, Sister Bay. Raise your hand if you've been to Door County, Wisconsin. Okay, awesome. And mountain biking through Peninsula State Park, taking kayaks out to Horseshoe Island, lounging on pontoon boats, having a chocolate malt at Wilson's. In fact, that lake for me connects to why I became minister at First-Plymouth. In the year 2000, my dad and I had rented a particular cabin right on the water in Sister Bay with a deck that was over the water, and we're sitting there on that deck, and out of nowhere, he says, "You know, there's a special church named First-Plymouth in Nebraska. You should consider being pastor there." And I said, "Nebraska?" I'd never been to Nebraska, and I said, "Dad, I'm in San Francisco, and I love it, and thanks anyway." He died a few years later and didn't realize how prescient he was that I came here. So the first time I ever heard of First-Plymouth right then, I had a Corona in one hand and some tortilla chips in the other. And that's a good way to hear about a church. So, did you know Jesus lived by the lake? Did you know that? I mean, you probably know he was born in Bethlehem. He was raised in Nazareth, but clearly in the Gospels, his home base is Capernaum. That's where he is. It said he came out of the house and sat by. He's in Capernaum most of his adult life. That's right on the lake. He lived on the lake. Do you know most of his miracles were on the lake? Most of his ministry was on the lake. His miracles, most of the miracles were right there lakeside. The finding the coin in the fish's mouth, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. It's all about the lake. The miraculous catch of fish in the lake. Walking on water, that's the lake. Stilling the storm on the lake. Half of his parables are told by the lake. And we have one today. And what a beautiful summer scene this is. Jesus is sitting by the lake shore. A crowd forms around him, so he gets in a little boat, pulls just off the water, and teaches from the boat to people on the lake shore. What a beautiful summer scene. Or not so much, actually. Because the parable he tells here is the parable of the sower, and it's pretty intense. I don't know if you noticed this, but it's pretty intense for a lazy summer day by the lake. This story, it says, the sower, he's the sower. He's telling a story. He's the sower, and he's sowing the gospel. But in the story, a lot of people won't receive the gospel. There's an intensity here. It'll hit a lot of rocky ground or thorns or scorching sun. Some might get it, but the story would make you think, Am I good soil? That's kind of an intense moment by the lake. Am I receiving the gospel? I just used the word gospel a couple times. Let me remind you how beautiful that word is in our tradition, because when I say gospel, in our tradition, we're not just referring to the 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. When I say gospel, I mean the entire message of Jesus Christ. The person, the life, the purpose, everything. When I say gospel, when we say gospel, we mean the entire deposit of our faith, the gospel. Now, if you take a step back, when I say the word gospel, you know what it means in the largest sense. It's all about love. I mean, we know this. In the largest sense, it's about love. The Bible reminds us God is love. In 1 John, no one has ever seen God, but when we love each other, God abides in us. And God's love is perfected in us, for God is love. So, beloved, we ought to love one another. So, we know the gospel means God is love, that Jesus is the perfect manifestation of this love. And that we are taught this love. We are supposed to join in that perfect actualization of love. Your main task, your soul's purpose, is to grow in love. Okay, that's the gospel from the biggest perspective. So by the lakeside here, this is kind of intense. He's asking, how are you doing with love? Are you good soil? Is love growing in your life? I mean, you might do a little bit of a self-inventory right now. How is love going in your life with family, with friends, with everyone you encounter? Are you fertile soil right now? But when I say gospel, it also means something very particular. It means very particularly the teachings of Jesus Christ, the purpose of his life. It means in particular fashion that Jesus Christ saves us, meaning brings us into wholeness, brings us back into right relationship with ourselves, with those around us, with God. We are put right through Jesus Christ. So gospel means that very particular message. And I've been wondering, how is that gospel doing in our world? Is it finding fertile soil right now? Let me share 3 conversations I had recently. First one, I was having coffee recently with a guy that was about 78 years old or so. He'd been a very successful lawyer, and we started talking about religion and church, and he said, you know, religion and all this church stuff, it's just BS. I said, church has a bachelor's of science? He goes, yeah, I think all this church stuff, theology, it's just kind of BS. He goes, like this message, it makes no sense. That God was so angry with us, that God required a blood atonement, that God had to kill his own son on the cross to forgive us of our sins, and that if you don't believe that God was so mad he needed a death, if you don't believe that, you're going to go to hell, and if you do believe it, you're going to go to heaven. He says, it just sounds like a load of you-know-what. I said, well, if you put it that way, it does. But then I got into a conversation with him. I said, you know, you're describing what's called substitutionary atonement. It's one of the atonement theories in church history, but there are others. And that's never been the only way to describe what happens on the cross, ever. I tried to tell him, in fact, in the Roman Catholic Church, the great magisterium of the Orthodox Catholic Church, that they don't have a doctrine of atonement. because they believe there has to be multiple ways to understand Jesus' death on the cross. And so they have what's called atonement theories, and they allow a range of ways to describe it. The historic church has always allowed different ways. One whole set of ways we describe it is called moral atonement theories. That when Jesus expresses that sacrificial love fully, being willing to die for us, and love is always sacrificial to some extent. It just always is. But when he is willing to die for his friends, that sacrificial love is so amazing that we are transformed. We are morally transformed by it. So in moral atonement theories, it's not that God has changed. It's not some angry God that has changed. We are changed. And we are opened up to a new way of living. I was describing to him, there's been lots of different atonement theories, but that in America, about a couple hundred years ago, substitutionary atonement, blood atonement, became the way American preachers talked about it, and they sort of hammered it in, and it's American preachers that try to convict you of your sin and say you're either going to heaven or hell, and that the historic church never thought of itself as a reward and punishment scheme and didn't talk about heaven and hell in those ways, and I kept talking, and then I said, well, what do you think? And he said, still sounds like BS to me. I didn't change his mind, but I was trying to help him understand that Christianity is so much more pluriform and variegated than he seemed to know. So much richer, the gospel. I had another conversation recently, and this was with a young man, about 27 years old. I was in a premarital session with him and his fiancée. You know, before a wedding, I have a meeting where I hear a lot about their lives, and we talk about their journeys, and I get to know them, and then we plan the ceremony, and always at some point, I ask them about their spiritual life. Do they come from a particular tradition? Or how would they describe their spirituality or faith? We have lots of different traditions at First-Plymouth. And so I asked him, and this guy said, you know, I'm just really not that interested. And he said it, there was nothing ornery about the way he said it at all. There was no animus. It wasn't like he was trying to share some big opinion. He just said very calmly, plainly, I'm not interested in that stuff. Do you know there's a word that came out this past decade, really interesting word, new word. It combines the word atheism meaning you don't believe there's God, atheism. It combines it with another English word of apathy, that you just don't care. And the new word is apatheism. And that there are many, many more apatheists. Not people that are atheists or believers, neither one of those. They just don't care. And my mind began to reel as he said it just so calmly, nicely. I'm not interested. My mind began to reel because when I say gospel, when I use that word, in one large measure, I mean the orientation of our lives. How are we to live this life? And that our lives have purpose. When I say gospel, I mean that your life matters. You are a beloved creation of God, and you have been created. Your soul is on a journey to grow in love, and it's an amazing journey. When I say gospel, I mean your life matters, and your life has a purpose. And so I was wondering in my mind, if you're not interested in that, does that mean you don't have a sense of purpose? I didn't say this out loud. I just began to wonder. Do you know, two things are happening concurrently in our society right now, and they seem to be going together. Number one, in the past decade, there has been a major decline in the humanities in our universities. The humanities, the professors, the student body, the amount of people taking classes, the humanities is almost in peril in universities. The departments are almost being eliminated or are being eliminated. And the humanities have always been about exploring what is a human life, a fully human life, and what are the values and purpose to a human life. Well, at the same time the humanities are disappearing, less people are associating with religion. Those two things have to be connected because they're both about what is it to be a human being. I've been reading this intense book this week by a French intellectual that believes in our society we're so caught up in what is useful and efficient and fast that our society is filled with what he calls means, not ends. We have newer and newer types of means, but we've lost the sense of having purpose or ends. So, for example, we have much more communication. There's communication from all angles, but is it saying anything important? It's all means. Or we can fly a jet and get somewhere faster than ever, but why are you really getting there? And why are you really living your life? Or you can work hard as a student and you can have good grades your whole life and you can be committed and you just do that and you build a resume but to what purpose? He says our life now is completely all about means, what is useful, what is efficient, and we're losing a sense of its purpose. Oh, I just was thinking, I wasn't talking to this young man, the premarital, about this stuff. I just was wondering, what if more and more people don't have a sense their life matters? The last conversation I had recently about this theme was, I just fell into a conversation with a young doctor. She was about 31 years old, and she found out I was a minister, and she said, "Oh, I'm scientific. I'm not into religion." Oh. I said, "You think those are opposed? Science and religion?" She goes, "Well, yeah. I mean, all that stuff it describes in the Bible, we've learned that's not how the world was created, and we know, yeah." I said, "Oh, do you think that those things in the Bible are trying to literally explain the physical universe? It's spiritual writing. You think it's about the physical universe?" She goes, "Well, isn't it?" You see, she was a perfect version of what's been called the conflict thesis. The idea that science and religion are in conflict. That really only came up in the late 1890s. For our whole church tradition, science or rational reasoning, inquisitiveness has never been considered opposed to the faith. In fact, 1,500 years ago, Augustine, the great church teacher, said that nothing we learn about nature could ever be in conflict with the Scripture because it's all God's creation. Galileo said there are two books for a Christian. Galileo was a devout Christian. And he said there are two books. We have our Holy Scripture and we have the book of creation. And both, if we explore them fully, can illuminate our understanding of God. But she had this notion, this is classic conflict thesis. This doctor thought the more science progresses, that means religion has to then recede. If you have more science, by definition, you'll have less religion. But I haven't experienced the faith that way at all. And classic Christian theologians talk about, isn't it amazing that we have been gifted with a brain that capable of rational thinking, and isn't it amazing that's coherent with a rationally ordered universe? Isn't that amazing? And the exercising of that brain and exploring the universe is to be Christian. In fact, Classic theologians will say God is utterly free. To be God is to be free. So God could have created the physical universe any way God wanted. God is totally free. So in fact, it's our duty to explore how is the physical universe ordered, because God could have created it any way. We can discover more and more. I've never thought science and religion were opposed. And I was talking to her about this, and I said, don't you understand what I'm trying to say? She goes, no, I don't. I think more science means less religion. So, how is the gospel doing in our world? Well, this is an intense lakeside conversation. But for you personally, I hope you're hearing the grace in it. Because, my friends, when I say the word gospel, there is always grace. And the grace in this story is, at this moment or at any moment, you might be rocky ground. You might not be receiving this incredible message of love and purpose and faith, the message of Jesus Christ. There might be thorny times for you where you don't sense it has any meaning or power over your life at all. But the grace is there might come a moment, another moment ahead of you, where you suddenly hear the gospel in a fullness you didn't even realize. That moment is always potentially ahead of us, that you suddenly hear the gospel in a completely new way. In our churches, that's been happening around LGBTQIA issues, and this sense of suddenly hearing the inclusive power of the gospel, that we're called to a type of inclusion that we didn't imagine before in this world. That's hearing the gospel in a new way right ahead of you. Right ahead of you, there might be a new time that you hear the gospel in a fullness. May it be so.